In this interview in our See the Voice series, Richard, VK7RO, talks to Frank, VK7FINF. Richard talks about his start in the world of amateur radio, his life in radio, and where he thinks it will end up in the future.
Richard, how long have you been involved in radio?
Gee, that's a hard question. I must have been involved in radio for 60 years. When I was in primary school, I lived at St Helens, and we moved to a new house, and on a heap of junk out the back were the remains of an old radio. And my father said, "There's enough bits there to be able to, you'd be able to build a crystal set." So I tried to find out how to build a crystal set by going to the library at school. And yes, they told you how to build a crystal set, but you needed bell wire. And I couldn't find anybody in St Helens who knew anything about bell wire. So I gave up radio until I went to high school in Devonport. Got my amateur licence in 1960. Getting it was quite good fun, I must tell you about that, because I lived at Latrobe, and I did the exam one night at the Devonport Post Office, and some clerk was running it, and he gave me the regulations exam, which lasted half an hour, and he sat around looking extremely bored, and then he started me off on theory, which went for 2.5 hours, and he got me started, and he said, "I'll just go over to the pub for a little while, it won't be long." So he disappeared, and an hour later he came back, and he looked at what I'd done and said, "Geez, have you written all that?" And he gave me a can of beer and went back to the pub again. But he turned up at the right time to stop the exam. Yeah, so I passed. But with a can of beer. I think it's easier to get a licence now because the foundation licence is a very good idea. It gets people started straight away, whereas beforehand you had to know how to build equipment if you wanted to do anything. Or you had to know a bit about it anyway. Nowadays, where you buy everything, the foundation licence is an excellent way to start. I remember I had an old dual wave receiver which I used to listen to when I was a teenager. I used to listen to the Voice of America Jazz Hour. I thought I was very sophisticated when I was 14. But the main rig I use at the moment is a Kenwood's TS930S. Getting a bit long in the tooth, but it still works all right. And because I'm interested in Morse, it has a few facilities which are handy for Morse, for sort of choosing the frequency you like to listen to, and filtering and bandwidth changing and all that sort of stuff. So on HF I mainly use that, but I have a number of other HF transceivers. Most recently I bought an IC703 that lives near my computer. I don't use it for transmitting much, but I use it for receiving attached to the computer. The reason I bought that is because it's very stable in frequency and runs off a temperature. All the oscillators run off a temperature compensated oscillator, so you can be pretty sure that it will stay on frequency for hours. Whereas my previous rigs used to drift all over the place. I certainly couldn't run them in winter if I wanted to turn the heater on to keep me warm, because the heat from the heater made the receiver drift. So I've been having some fun in recent years with computer-assisted reception of various things, atmospheric beacons and that sort of thing. It seems to me there's always been two sorts of amateurs: people who like building things and people who like talking. And I've been somebody who likes building things. So very often I will build something and I'll talk to people a few times to see how it works, and then I don't talk much anymore. Morse code I became interested in, probably because you don't have to talk very much. The contacts can be extremely short. In fact, some of them are too short for fun anymore. Tasmania is very rare on Morse code, and if anybody in Europe hears you, I only want to say 5NN, which is an abbreviation for 599, just the very briefest amount of information exchange. Call sign and signal report, even if the signal report is nonsense. But I don't enjoy that much. I at least like to find out who I'm talking to and where he lives. That upsets him a little bit. I very much like mucking about with the computer attached to my radio. There's all sorts of interesting things that you can do with the different digital modes, and I've experimented with quite a number of them. I remember one was PSK31. I remember hearing this funny weak warbly signal on 20 metres one day. I had no idea what it was, but I went looking on the internet and I found what I thought must be a description of this signal, so I downloaded the software and started playing with it. And it worked really well. It's almost as good as Morse code. The problem is that I gave a little talk about it at the club here, and a number of people in Hobart started using it, and one of them unfortunately was within line of sight, and as everybody all works within a few kc of each other on 20 metres, whenever he started transmitting, he'd knock back the AGC in my receiver and I couldn't hear the weak station that I was listening to, so I sort of shot myself in the foot a bit there, but I like that. And there's other digital modes that I've played with, but Hellschreiber was one that I like very much, mostly because the computer doesn't do all the decoding. What it is like an extremely slow television system, and it draws a picture of each letter, and you have to be able to decipher the picture, the letter from amongst the noise, so you're involved as well as the computer. But I like that one, although it's gone out of fashion a bit now. The future of amateur radio isn't very bright, I don't think, because there's so much interference around now. Some years ago I started listening on low frequency, around 180 kilohertz, to stations in New Zealand. In the last couple of years I haven't been able to hear them. And the only difference I can think is that there's just more noise around my house and coming from neighbours' houses. Recently my neighbours appear to have bought a very noisy piece of equipment, because there's now interfering signals 20 over 9 on 80 metres. It makes me think that BPL was the least of our worries. So it's becoming very difficult. It might be when the sunspots come back in and I can use higher frequencies that I won't have so much trouble, but 80 metres is a washout, 40 metres less so. I don't know about 20 metres.
Well, what would you say to people that say that amateur radio is strictly for old people?
I don't think amateur radio is strictly for old people. Obviously there's a lot of older people involved in it, but it's always been that way, I think. When I started there were a lot of elderly people, but there were young people as well. But as soon as you get old enough that you get married and have children, your interest sort of wanes for a while, and people move out of the amateur scene and then come back again when they get older, when their kids have left home. So, I still think there's room for both. And certainly with all the computer assisted stuff that's available now, young people can really get involved in that and they know much more about it than I do.